Hey folks, Jack from Moonshift Audio here. In this video I'm going to take a look at the track Smoke from Caroline Polachek's recent album Desire I Want to Turn Into You. I really like how this track references UK rave music from the early 90s, in particular the bass and the drums. Here's a look at what I'll be making. Desire was probably my favourite pop album of 2023, and the majority of it was produced by Danny L. Hall, a UK-based producer with strong links to the PC music label. If you've heard his excellent 2021 album Hardcore, you'll know that he's no stranger to UK rave productions, and it's really nice to hear some of these influences coming in on this track. Firstly, you've got the drums, which have a really nice breakbeat feel to them, but that's been reined in quite a bit and it's actually quite reserved, although the big reverb on the kick is definitely a nice nod to some of those breakbeats that were used in those early 90s productions. Then you've got the bass. The first time I heard this huge sweeping bass line, I instantly thought of the classic hoover bass sound from early jungle, drum and bass and old school tracks. The hoover bass was made by sampling a Reese or detuned saw wave and pitching it up and down in a sampler to turn it into a really high energy and aggressive sound like this. The bass that Danny's using in Smoke takes a similar approach, but the pitch sweep is really nice and smooth and the whole thing sits in the body of the track rather than being a lead. The thing I like the most about using retro sounds in a modern track this way is that by choosing a particular sound, you're making a direct reference to another time, another genre, and another scene, but at the same time you're making something new. There are some excellent examples of this throughout Desire, but for now let's jump into Serum and have a look at this bass patch. Okay, so here we are in Serum and let's get stuck in and make this take on a hoover bass. We'll start off with the oscillators like we normally might, and for this patch I'm going to use the JNO, which is modelled on the Roland Juno. We can put that in wavetable position number 2 and we're going to crank the unison all the way up to 8. We'll lower the octave a couple. Yeah, that'll do for oscillator A. For oscillator B, we'll perhaps just go down 1 octave so we've got a bit more high end in the track, but we probably don't need quite so much of it. We'll pull that down to about 50%. We will also use the JNO, but we'll put the wavetable position up to 5 so we've got a bit of variation there, and we'll put the unison up to 6. You can hear the nice high frequencies coming in now. We're also going to use a sub oscillator on this one. It's going to be at the same octave as the main bass oscillator, and we're just going to use the basic sine wave to add some kind of weight to the bottom, because when you're using a super saw with quite a high unison, sometimes the bottom end lacks a kind of thickness and a solidity, so adding that just helps to keep it nice and solid down there. Very important to this patch is going to be the voicing. So we want a monosynth, i.e. we only want to be able to play one note at once, and we want it to be legato, so that if a second note is triggered while one note is playing, it doesn't re-trigger all the oscillators. And we're going to need some portamento, and that's going to be, I worked out for this one about something like 870, 875. Bearing in mind this is for a BPM of 124. You might, if you were using a fast, if you were doing something more drum and bass tempo, you might want a faster portamento because the kind of lurch that we get is going to be tempo dependent. So here we go. This is without. And with that, we're starting to get there already. So onto the filter, we want to make sure that it's acting on the sub oscillator as well as oscillators A and B. And for this, I'm using the German low pass. I just really like the sound of this filter. The cutoff, I'm going to set to about 760, 770 hertz. Lovely. Resonance, we don't need much at this point. 10% is fine. The drive, this is quite a distorted patch, so we're going to put some drive in for sure. It up. And now it's onto the envelopes. For envelope 1, we don't need to do much at all, just put a bit of release. I put about half a second on, just so it doesn't die away too quickly. Okay, so onto envelope 2, which we're using to add just a little bit of a growl, a sort of sweeping growl to the start of each one of these notes. So we're going to want an attack of about 3/4 of a second, 750, something like that. We're going to pull the sustain all the way down, and the decay is actually going to be similar. It's going to be like just over 800, something like that. The release, we can match the amp envelope, and then we're going to drag this just a tiny amount onto the filter cutoff just to give it a little bit of a peak. 4, 5, 6 is fine. And the main thing that we're going to use this for is to boost the resonance. So you should hear a sort of snarling there, which is something that I heard that I really liked about the original sound. That's the basis of our sound, so we're just going to have a quick look at some of the effects. I found that it definitely needed a bit of a compressor, and I'm going to lower the threshold down to about -11, just so we actually see that starting to... We don't want to absolutely crush it. Everything else is absolutely fine. Maybe put a tiny bit of gain in. Next up, distortion. I really like the tube emulation in Serum, so I'm going to leave it there. We'll have it on the EQ post and band pass. And really what we're trying to do here is just really kind of gnarl up the low end, like the low mids. So a Q of about 4.5 is great. And yeah, something in like between like 250 hertz, something like that. Probably a reasonable amount of drive. Okay, so that's the bass line. I've made that patch available to download. There's a link down below in the description of this video. Next up, I'll have a dive into the other elements that I included in this little project. I didn't have a vocal when I put this together, so rather than trying to recreate the track exactly, I've done my own take on it, and I couldn't resist going just a bit harder than the original, especially with the drums. Let's take a look. Okay, so we're back in the project now, and I'm going to start with the drums. Here's them soloed. And we'll have a quick look at the kit I loaded into battery. This is actually one of the stock kits. It's a funk kit, and I'm not making use of very many of the drums, and I haven't changed anything at all with the settings here in battery. This is a bit of a quick and dirty sketch that I threw together just for this video, so I haven't gone in depth with the production on it. But here's the drum pattern that I played. You can see that I haven't used that many of the elements at all. I've got the kick, the snare, the side stick, and then if we go up here, I've just made a use of a couple of the shakers. And that's it. So if we have a quick look at the processing that I've put on these elements, we're going to have a look at the kick first. I'll solo it for you. And here we go. So we started off with a clipper, and you can see I'm just clipping off the very loudest parts of that signal, which just helps to rough it up a bit, and will help us to squeeze a bit more headroom out of that, because everything in this beat is very loud. Following that, we've got a decapitator. It's going quite hard. You can see that I've activated the punish button, which isn't something I do very often. If I bypass this, I'm just going to turn off the reverb. You can really hear the distortion working there, and it's really giving it some nice presence going into that reverb. Lastly, a pretty standard looking EQ for a kick drum. I'm boosting the fundamental, which is where the boom is, scooping out some of the mud at 300 Hz, and just because that bell there, if we bypass that, you can see it's pulling down a bit of the meat in the 500 Hz range. I'm putting that back in with a bit of a boost there. So here's the kick with EQ and without. Let's take a look at the reverb. So I'm sending to a dedicated kick reverb bus, and there's actually quite a lot going on here. So we've got a Valhalla vintage verb on a fat drums preset. I've pulled the decay down a bit because I wanted it to die away fully before the next hit. We're then EQing the reverb. I'm scooping out a load of the mid-range. Let's just hear what this sounds like without this scoop. It's very present, and I wanted it to sit back a bit in the mix. We just get a bit more of the boom and a bit less of that kind of wash with this EQ in. I'm then compressing the reverb, which helps to really fatten up that tail without the compressor. Just helps to kind of rein it all in, make it a bit more controlled. So following that, I've got another EQ, which I decided later when I heard it in the context of the mix, I wanted to take even more of the mid-range and mud out of that. So if I was to play with the EQ and without, you can hear that's really quite present. And the EQ just helps it sound a lot smoother. And finally, I'm using a decapitator, which is not something that you often find on a reverb, but it really helps to kind of put the presence back in the places where you need it. So if I just put this back in the mix, and I'll bring the decap back. Now, particularly for playback on smaller speakers, that's really going to help that reverb come through. Okay, so that's the kick. Let's take a listen to the snare. As I'm sure you can hear, quite a lot of drive from a decap just on its bass A setting. The A is definitely my favorite. The A stands for Amperex tape, but it's not modeling a tape saturation. It's actually modeling the transformer in a particular tape machine. If I was to bypass that, just really helping give that snare some of the slap. I'm compressing the snare as well with a Pro C. Quite a lot, just to control it if I was to bypass that. Really helps thicken it up. I've got a clipper on board as well. Really absolutely slamming this snare. And then a Pro Q just to give it a bit of a mid-range boost, help it cut through the mix. I'm just going to turn off the reverb for a second. And we can hear this snare with everything and now without. Pretty feeble. Much more like it. The snare is going to a drum reverb, and that is literally the drum plate setting of Vintage Fur Valhalla. I think I pulled the decay down just to help it die away and not clutter up the mix too much, but that's literally it. The side stick is a big one, but again, we're not needing to do very much to this. I've just got a decap with a lot of drive. Really bringing out the presence by quite aggressively driving that. And I've rolled off all of the low end and given it a bit of a presence boost. It's quite harsh, this 7K region, so you've got to be careful, but actually harsh is what I wanted with this. It's quite an aggressive drum sound overall. Just giving it that real brightness. The other drums is just where those shakers are coming out, and I've left them completely as they are, with just a little bit of a reverb sound. All of that goes to a drum bus, where I'm slamming it with some parallel compression. I love this plugin. It's just such a simple, quick, easy way to add some really slamming parallel compression. I will solo so you can just hear the compressed signal. Now that's really spanked and it's kind of sucked the life out of it, but if we just have, this is without any, we'll feed some in. Just kind of brings it all even more to life. One thing you have got to be careful though is that this kind of compression can do some fucky things with your stereo width. And I can hear that that does narrow things ever so slightly, but I'm not too concerned on this track. Following the parallel compression, I've just done a bit of a high-end boost with this Polachek. 4 dBs in at 8K. This is without. That will also be adding some subtle saturation as well. And I'm doing even more of a high-end boost with the Soundtoys CQ. I'm not sure if this is still free, but it used to be free, and it's actually a really nice character EQ. Let's play that with and without. The last element of these drums, which is something that I forgot to mention earlier, is the think loop. So this is just the tambourine from the classic Think break. It sounds like this. I'm scooping out all of the bottom end of that. There's quite a lot down there. Now, I really love this. The Think break in general is just such a powerful groove, and being able to get that tambourine on its own is just such a good way to add some real energy, especially if you're programming everything else. It's just got such a nice human groove to it. Let's play the track without that. It's quite far back in the mix, but it just gives it a lift. Let's listen. Okay, we'll bring it in now. Instant energy. The final part of the drums is this sine wave underlay for the kick. Now, I have literally just got a basic sine wave here in Serum, and it's playing on the first kick of every bar, which is that big main kick. I'm literally doing nothing here at all. I was playing around with a decapitator, but I decided it was best without. It is getting some saturation though, because it's going out on the drum bus, so it's getting spanked through that parallel compression, and there'll be some additional saturation applied here in the Polachek, quite possibly in the CQ as well. That's just to give some extra low end oomph underneath the kick. If I solo just the drums, I'll take away this sine wave. I'll bring it back. Massive. Now, the bass we've already looked at, so that just leaves a couple of samples. I got a vocal shout from Splice going to its own reverb, and it's got an echo boy with a nice ping pong delay. The reverb is Valhalla Vintage Verve. I think this is actually literally the initial patch that you get when you load it up for the first time. I don't think I've even changed the decay. Again, quick and dirty with this one. I've also got a riser that I also got off Splice. That's going to the same reverb as the Hey, just to give it a nice bit of a tail. And there you go. If you found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, tutorials and downloads. I'm going to play out with a little sketch I was playing around with for this track. Till next time.